Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points. This is a new endeavor for us because normally it's just Matt and I, but a friend of mine wanted to come on the podcast and just have a interesting discussion with us. So today we are going to discuss something which is not at all controversial. Well, I guess it is controversial depending on who you ask, but it's not controversial in the sense that like tax policy is controversial. And that's a debate between, it was like 1971 or something in the 1970s between Noam Chomsky and the late Michel Foucault. Um, the debate, I guess, the overarching theme was about human nature. What is human nature? Is there such a thing as human nature? Can we define it? And they also talked a lot about, especially in the second half, about politics. Um, so, and as I was telling these guys before we started recording, I watched this a couple years ago, and I came out very pro Chomsky, and Foucault's arguments really didn't. I didn't resonate with Foucault's arguments. I didn't quite understand them, or um, I wasn't very sympathetic to them, and so I wanted to watch it again to see if my thought process had changed any, if I was able to get anything out of it that I hadn't gotten out of it previously. Um, and I think I did get more out of it this time around, or at least I better understand Foucault's kind of epistemological views and philosophical views, as well as his political views. Um, because he's one of those figures that I guess he's associated with postmodern thought, but obviously, what is postmodernism? That's a big question, and people can debate that for hours. But I have to say, though, I don't think my opinions on the overall issues really changed that much. Um, I was thinking they might have, but they really didn't. I was still fairly I was more sympathetic to Chomsky's views, especially when it came to like the scientific method and knowledge and his conceptions of human nature. Um, I think Foucault had more of a point in when he was discussing politics, um, because I am less, or the older I get, the less I feel like I can sketch out a political program in a systematic fashion. Um, but I think that's a good place to begin the conversation. So whichever of you, whoever wants to jump in now, can do so.
So I had a lot of thoughts going into this. For first, obviously, Keegan is joining us, and I know you mentioned that, and he's going to have a lot of insights on this, and it'll be great to have a third voice in here for the first time in dozens and dozens of episodes. But this was an interesting debate because it's a lot of stuff that we don't talk on a lot. A lot of it was about the brain and how we model information and thinking about things. And this actually flows a lot from our conversation last week about political ideology and how at some point you were kind of arguing everybody has an ideology because everybody has a mental framework in which they kind of solve problems through. And then Chomsky in this debate, he tries to talk about creativity, and he kind of points to creativity as this almost like a novel act somebody does that is built on almost some kind of way that people have built a mental process to think about things. So a lot of the contention between Foucault and Chomsky is about understanding the knowledge that is out there that humans could potentially understand, and then how they conceptualize how that process works. I think that's the most uncontroversial part about the whole debate, considering a lot of people don't have hardcore opinions on epistemology. I thought it was a really interesting way of thinking about how people uncover knowledge. And I think this is where you and me and Matt might disagree. And I think where me and Keegan could potentially line up. Because I was definitely more, I guess, sympathetic to Foucault's way of putting it. Foucault kind of, the analogy he liked to use is uncovered new knowledge, just like overlaying grids on the existing knowledge out there. And sometimes when you discover ways about thinking things, you start ignoring other types of knowledge. But it's still somewhat a process of removing barriers, but there's more to it than that. And then Chomsky kind of just says there are different existing frameworks, and then our society kind of helps guide which framework you end up that you end up leading up to. And you guys can correct me if my interpretation's kind of wrong on this, but I'm just kind of trying to get a summary out there a little bit. Um, but in the end, I just think Foucault had this really good point of kind of pointing out, why are we assuming that this is human nature? Why are we assuming all these types of thinking is specifically novel to humans? And as we look back, 50 years later on this debate, and they talk about how you can hear about how there are AI neural networks out there that essentially recreate processes of understanding things and, trying to create novel thoughts with AI. It is like, why are these mental processes novelly human, and does it have to do with the ethic of a society or how people's experiences shape them and things like this? And why is it as simple as, removing barriers? I think that's like a little simplistic. That was a lot of my initial thoughts on that part of the conversation.
Yeah, I think what I find interesting about it, it's another thing I sort of touched on before we started rolling, is that I do really see it as like somebody from the French postmodernist school and an American analytic, and that's almost, it like benefits almost from them speaking in different languages. That French is sort of the language of postmodernism, in the same way that like Italian is the language of opera. But both the political debate that they sort of takes up the second half and the debate about human nature, it seems like they both sort of take a stance that is appropriate to those two camps. And that what I found interesting about Chomsky's sort of account of creativity is that he's kind of pointing at it as like a basis of some sort of objective, almost like a priori human knowledge, because of the fact that creativity it exists within a set of grammatical rules that are seemingly, like, what is the phrase that Chomsky uses? Like, it takes all of this disparate data and somehow makes this leap and aggregates it into a language where now we can all go around like expressing these thoughts, and you understand what I say, and how there's like an inherent grain of creativity to that, where you can't just say, like, there's no objectively the best way to write out a certain sentence. But at the same time, there's some sort of like inherent building blocks or rules that we're all communicating with. And that Chomsky looks at it from that framework. And I think he's kind of teasing out, he's like, does that point to some sort of innate human nature? The fact that we have this somehow a priori ability to grasp languages, is that some sort of human nature? Whereas like Foucault, it seems like, what does he say? I wrote down, so he agrees freedom can only exist in a system of regularity, but he kind of questions, he's like, is this really an innate human nature? As you said, questioning the definition of what we call it, but he says maybe it was social movements, maybe it's class struggles. It seems like he's almost pointing to, it's always the environmental factors. He says something external to the human brain. And so it seems like Foucault is looking at the human being as part of this, like, it's like a becoming framework, like that I've always heard that he's got an intellectual kinship with Nietzsche, and it definitely seems like it comes out with that he's like, this is just a dynamic royal of all these external forces, and that's what creates like the human being, and that he's emphasizing the social structure and the broader pattern above the individual, which Chomsky, as like sort of the liberal analytic, really has, I think, a view of like this individual human nature that is somehow objective or gives you access to some sort of like, at least some objective foundation of knowledge. And that was where I really sound, because then when they talk about this political debate, justice versus power, for Foucault, it's all about this becoming process. It's all about, well, it doesn't matter what is just, this abstract valuation. The working class is going to uprise because it's to their advantage, and that's sort of like the way of things. So I don't know. That would be my first kind of initial reactions, is like their disagreements are really subtle at times and almost hard to pick up on what exactly it was they were disagreeing on. And a lot of times they were just kind of clarifying each other. But it did seem like over time some of those things came out of the human being as this locus of of individuality or just this emergent property of the social forces?
So I think like the question, what is human nature, or does human nature exist? I think we're at or at some level we're at a disadvantage due to the limits, at least at the moment, of the social sciences. You can't quite study human beings in the same way that you can study bees or stars. There's the natural sciences, because they're less complicated. I mean, at some level, like physics is the least complicated subject you could ever study. And I know that sounds crazy, but I mean, only in the sense that of the level that the level at which no, what am I trying to say? Think about it like layers, I guess, or think of it as like a pyramid. And going up that pyramid, what you're studying is more and more complex. So I think that the physical world, at some sense, is the least complex thing you'll have to study, or you could ever study. But like the human mind is the most complex thing you could ever study, even though it all builds on top of each other. And most people would say that the mind, like that everything, including mind, derives from physics. But Newtonian mechanics is far simpler than trying to account for thought. So that is kind of where we're at the moment in the history of knowledge and our ability to understand ourselves. But I guess to push back a little on what you guys are, what you Matt and Keegan are saying, because humans are animals. I think it's a fairly uncontroversial statement. Because humans are animals, because they evolved in the same way that armadillos and bees and wasps and snakes evolved. That means that that there has to be like something, I guess, that makes us human, or there has to be a nature, if you will, to what it means to be human. Otherwise, we wouldn't be human. We're not these, like, unless one derives their values, I guess, from a religious framework, which if anyone watches this show, they know I don't. We're not these angels that derive from that derive our essence from God, and we're not therefore separate from the natural world. We're part of the natural world, and we happen to have the minds and the capability of disassociating from the natural world, or distancing ourselves from the natural world, but we come from the natural world. So that's really, I guess, kind of my starting point for an argument for the concept of human nature, however elusive that concept may be.
So I have two things. I have an extra example that I think is also relevant to what you're kind of laying out about the limitations of certain sciences. And I like to name drop Taleb, who he wrote The Black Swan and does a lot on probability and math. And the big thing that he points out is he like famously had a meeting with a bunch of investors in Vegas, and he talked about understanding probabilities. And people like to talk about gambling, but gambling is actually, in a way, the most basic way of understanding probability, because all the outcomes are known. Probability of all the potential outcomes at any time are known, right? So if you're playing blackjack and all the cards were face up, you could estimate the probabilities of every event. But when you gamble on the stock market, you don't know if there's going to be a pandemic in the next year or 5 years or 10 years and stuff like that. And there's like an endless amount of possible outcomes. So I think that's a similar example of like how you can bring up Newtonian physics. And it's like, well, when you do kinds of hard sciences, a lot of things are known. But when you talk about other things, it's like, well, there are all these unknowns you can't consider. So I think something that Foucault might point out is a lot of our mental frameworks are based in the environments that we're in. But I don't know if it's easy to imagine, or if even Foucault would kind of like this thought experiment. But if you could imagine like bizarro universe, people are born into complete like an habitable planet, but there is absolutely, I guess, no overlap to the type of setting you're born into 5,000 years into that planet existing. So like you're pretty much in like maybe, well, I almost want to say like a jungle because that's the opposite of our current society. But you have to imagine something that's almost like you have to imagine something Lovecraftian, right? Where all of his creatures are, you're not even supposed to be able to imagine what they are. That's how horrible they are. You have to imagine if a human person with our like brain capacity was in a situation we couldn't even imagine, if all their mental structures would be completely different because they'd have to go about solving whatever the problems of that planet are in a completely different way. Would we end up in the same, like with the same mental heuristics and structures? And I don't think it's easy to say yes. And that those are the kinds of like weird ways of thinking about it that Foucault kind of made me kind of, okay, because I watched this last night, so I kind of slept on it and let it settle. And I was just kind of reflecting on, well, there are all these things that I can't even begin to comprehend because they're so removed from my experience that why should somebody like me say that there are certain things that are a priori to, I guess, human nature to some extent, when if we had drastically like unimaginably different experiences, why would we end up in a remotely similar place? I think to some extent Chomsky acknowledges that, because he kind of does say that our experience can bring out what mental structures are valid. But I guess I'm hesitant to say that they're uniquely human and not think, well, they're uniquely human in the sense that bound by my experience as a human, in 2021 on planet Earth, they seem uniquely human. But I don't know why I should be so limited in my I don't know, an abstract thinking if we're gonna address it in like a philosophical way.
Yeah, I think Chomsky does. I think it was Chomsky who said if a lion could speak, we would not understand him. It might have been a different linguist, but that kind of hints almost at what both of you were kind of saying, like the idea of putting, whether it's a human being or in a different species, you have different selection pressures in a different environment. Would your thought process be different? And the idea of like a lion, if a lion could speak or had language, it wouldn't have the same like deep grammar as human beings. And so maybe there is something, I don't know, like what Matt was saying in terms of some sort of universal, I don't know, set of, I wouldn't want to call them first principles, but like a metalogic or whatever to language or whatever across human society. But I think what ANCAP, Matt, see, this is where it gets difficult now. We'll figure it out somehow. But with what you were saying, I think is kind of the objection Foucault raises of being able to define human nature, of where do you, okay, we might permit that exists. Like there's some sort of foundational, I don't know, what would you call it? Foundational logical or linguistic rules in the human brain. Just as there's a certain set of things about all humans, regardless of your culture, like you need water, you need food, you need shelter. So there's going to be like a set of things that are going to be universal. But I think like I bring this up a lot when I talk with Matt in Discord of Nietzsche's phrase, the congenital defect of all philosophers, which in Nietzsche's idea, the congenital defect of all philosophers is they take truths that they apprehend that are true because they're true in their context or in their particular time and place, and then they universalize it to all of the human race for all time. He's like, this is the problem all philosophers have had. And he basically says a lot of the time that was their problem, like because they would have had a truth if they had just been satisfied with a little truth rather than making it a big truth, an overarching truth. And I think that maybe that's what Foucault is kind of like highlighting, that which would be apropos to the postmodernist project of just sort of being skeptical of, okay, maybe there is a human nature. How are you going to localize and define what it is? And I do kind of like what Foucault says, that it's like a research indicator. Like that feels like something Eric Weinstein would say or something. Like it's just pointing you in the direction that this is an issue, or this is a fertile field of inquiry to look into. But it does become hard once you say there is this objective human nature, because that's the seed of like a morality at that point. If you like take that seriously, of like, yeah, there is this objective set of things that human beings want or makes human beings happy or whatever, that's oftentimes been the basis of trying to fine tune your society to create that. And so, whatever they're positive or negative, you could think about somebody like Sam Harris is written a book suggesting that there could be an objective morality based on science. Or you may consider Ayn Rand is another famous one of objectivism, that I believe she famously said, so much for the ought and is distinction. So yeah, I don't know. I guess those are my reflections about that it's like there is a human nature, but it's I don't know. It's very fraught once you start defining it.
I mean, I think it's very fraught. I guess maybe I still find it useful. I guess I still find the concept human nature to be useful, even if I'm not able to define it as rigorously as some people would want me to. And but just to clarify something, I think you were, Keegan, referring to what Foucault calls the epistemological indicator, an index of the problem that still has an index of a problem that still has to be uncovered. So I guess Foucault is kind of saying, well, human nature is a stand-in for, I guess, our understanding of what it means to be human. It's just, but it's something that he would say it's
like dark matter.
It's like dark matter, yes. But I mean, that doesn't, I guess from my perspective, I don't see that as invalidating human nature. I think it just means we have yet to fully, I think it just means we haven't fully understood ourselves. And it might be it might be that we're never able to. Perhaps that is a limit, especially in terms of the scientific method. Maybe we'll never truly be able to understand ourselves in as objective of a way as we can understand matters that natural scientists study. But I just keep going back to hey, actually, here I have a better way to get this conversation, or I have a better way to continue this conversation. I need you guys to maybe unpack more your criticisms of human nature, or why you're more on the Foucault side, because I guess I have trouble understanding Foucault's critique of human nature, except just at a very basic level that I've kind of agreed with. I mean, I agree that we don't understand what it means to be human, at least in a systematic, rigorous fashion. But I don't quite see how that invalidates human nature per se. So one of you or both of you, if you could
just really quick to clarify, I probably don't see. I'm critical of Chomsky for a lot of the reasons Foucault was, but I don't know if I necessarily, Foucault's answer to a lot of this seems to me to be kind of a punt of like, well, how do you define that? And he kind of kicks the can down the line. Like later on when he talks about justice, it's a valid critique to say maybe we shouldn't come up with a conception of what justice will be like in our ideal society, because that will be invariably based on our idea of justice as alienated members of this unideal society. So how are we to say what it's like, it's the old Alan Watts problem of like the person who needs to be improved is the one doing the improving. So you're already in a vicious circle, basically. I get it. Like I think it's a valid objection. Ultimately, I don't know if I think that really does it for me as an argument. I don't think Foucault really satisfied me in rebutting what Chomsky had to say. So I don't know if I do have like a good counter narrative of like, because I think we probably are not that dissimilar. I do kind of see a value in the idea of human nature. I like Foucault's kind of skepticism about it, I'll just say.
So I guess just to build before Matt,
Yeah.
I'll let you finish or I'll let you speak. I just wanted to build a little on what I was saying. I want to use, I guess, an analogy of a different argument he makes, and that's when he's talking about the history of science. So Foucault was a famous historian of science, and he wrote works on psychiatry, on medicine, and he was kind of illustrating, I guess, or he was critiquing the idea of I guess, progress in the natural sciences, or at least progress as many people in the natural sciences and who study the history of science define it. Because he was kind of saying, well, I guess the phrase he was using was like different grids. It's just like grids on top of grids on top of grids, and you might be and new scientific advances. They're often kind of they go silent on certain issues that previous scientists were very concerned about, and they might even let go of or ignore or suppress certain facts or certain knowledge that previous scientists had. But when from what I understand of the history of science, when I hear him say that, I almost see that as a non-point, in the sense that, like, yes, everyone acknowledges the scientific method is imperfect, and there are regressions, and there occasionally scientists are not very nice people, or they just don't know what they're talking about. So scientists can learn a lot from looking at scientists from 100, 200, 300 years ago, and kind of, as Chomsky says, incorporate some ideas that scientists previously had in order to get a greater synthesis, in order to build a synthesis. And so that's also my critique of Chomsky's view of human nature. I see it as almost a non-point. I guess, kind of going back to what Keegan was saying, he is critiquing these things, but I don't see a way of kind of maybe acting out that philosophy in the world, or I don't see I don't see Foucault's philosophy as a philosophy which really helps you do things like pursue the scientific method, or understand what a just society is, or to understand what human nature is. He's almost like the guy in the stand throwing rocks at the at the athletes. It's like he's not in the game; he's criticizing the game. But if you're in the game, or you're trying to be in the game, or that's not necessarily very helpful. So go ahead, Matt.
Well, I think you're bringing up a few things, and probably the most important way of thinking about that is you just have to ask yourself the question of what is Foucault's goal by even bringing it up. And there are certain people who go out of their way to try to give you a coherent worldview that is oftentimes has lots of failings, and you'll see all sorts of low IQ political pundits try to tell you their worldview is true, and then they're trying to answer every single thing. Foucault is almost doing the exact opposite, where he's not really presenting anything. He's just casting, he's throwing rocks at them. And if you accept that's what he's doing, it's fine. Not everything has to be providing a worldview with it. And this is kind of part of why I think we got hung up in our discussion on political ideology last week, is because some things are meant to be incomplete. So some things aren't meant to give you answers. They're just certain basic points. They're different. If you have a worldview, you could have like a quarter of it dedicated to something, a quarter of it dedicated to the other, and then you fashion it together. But not every philosopher is looking to give a collectivized argument. So what I see Foucault doing a lot of is he's really just telling you, hey, a lot of these things may seem like objective truths, and it's easy to think of them as objective truths. But if you look at things historically, you can tell how these are shaped by influences at the time. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about how Foucault kind of removes himself from his ideology and the arguments he makes, because he sees the issue with personalizing, being the philosopher and personalizing it. So he removes himself from it, and he's just kind of saying like, well, it's easy to understand mental models that way, and that might be a good point. But since that's all of our experiences, all of us in the Western world, why are we assuming? Why are we being so arrogant to assume that that's all human nature could possibly be when we don't really know that? So I think a valid criticism of Foucault, and this is kind of ends up being, I guess if you dumb down the criticism of Foucault, it turns into the Jordan Peterson BoomerCon criticism of Foucault, which is, congratulations, you said that everything might not be real, but does it really change how I live my life? And the answer could very easily be, no, it doesn't change how you live your life. But that's not really the point of Foucault. Now, you can incorporate Foucault into a lot of ideologies as a certain, as a certain axis or like a junction point of thinking about things. And this is where, when it comes into politics, Foucault's like, okay, well, when the bourgeoisie takes over, when the proletariat usurps the bourgeoisie, are they really a proletariat, or are they going to adopt the same mental framework as the bourgeoisie because they're in the same society? So it's like maybe Foucault isn't meant to actually provide us answers to things. Maybe he is a useful point of reference when you're analyzing a situation or looking at things in terms of criticizing historical events or what went wrong. And I think that that's a very valuable thing to think about. And that is probably the most value you can get out of Foucault, which kind of brings back to the first question that if anybody tries to watch this video might find themselves asking 15 minutes in is, why am I watching this? They're talking about these kind of absurd niche philosophy things. But it's interesting to hear these and then incorporate them into very far out there thoughts. So that's kind of how I reconciled it a little bit.
Can I just clarify really quickly a quick point you were making? I think we should. I just think it's important to acknowledge here in this point in the conversation, the scientific method. Actually, it really is not really about constructing a systematic worldview. So I think many people misunderstand the nature of the scientific method. In many ways, the scientific method is very similar to, or the like the way of thinking that people, the way of thinking that is the basis of the scientific method is at some level also the same basis for the philosophy of pragmatism. It is empiricism. Plus experimentation, I guess, would be the way to simplify the scientific method. So when we're talking about things like, I guess, human nature and justice, then we are talking about things related to a more overarching worldview. But the scientific method itself really does not, at least from what I understand of the scientific method, it's really not about putting forward a worldview and saying you have to accept it. It is about it is about trying and failing most of the time, but trying. It's like, and I've used this metaphor before, I think, on the podcast. It's like if you move into a new house and you find a puzzle piece, and then a week from after that you find two puzzle pieces, you might never find the whole puzzle. But the scientific method is about finding as many puzzle pieces as possible to get a general idea of what's going on. But that's not necessarily the same thing as a worldview.
I think Keegan and I might be saying the same thing, so I'm going to give it a shot because I could tell he wants to say something and I want to say something, and it seems like we're aligned, at least on this episode. Okay, so I'm going to tie together something from probably like episode 7 where we did the Sam Harris Jordan Peterson debates, and Jordan Peterson is talking about how and this kind of actually flows into something Chomsky said, where it's like, imagine the equation 2 + 2 = 4. Well, it's not just saying 2 + 2 = 4, but it's also saying 2 + 2 equals all the numbers that aren't 4, which includes 4.1, 4.2, 4.3. So you have to know which facts to care about, right? So when I look over and I see that the comforter on my bed is red, it's not just that's red, but it's every color that isn't that shade of red. So how Foucault could criticize, I guess, science as a field, and to some extent the scientific, so to some extent you can criticize science because it's like, look, here are all the things that seem to be facts that we seem to have uncovered, at least to some extent. But if you live in a society where you don't have an infinite amount of resources, you choose to investigate certain things, and different people, based on the worldview they grew up in, decide to investigate certain things that seem important or relevant for whatever reason. So sure, you can have all this information, but in the end, it's like, what questions did you focus on and why? Well, if you're not, at some point, human beings have to decide what questions are important. So Foucault could easily say, well, yeah, you've done all this science, but it's based on these human models of evaluating what is necessary to look into, which is based on your environment and experience and so forth and so forth. So even though you seem to have proved all these things with science, there are all these things you have not investigated, and they could potentially contradict this, and they haven't even crossed your radar because you're not interested in them. And that's how you even got to that ground level. That's the first thing that came to my mind. So maybe he's not necessarily critiquing the process, but given that everything is finite, that's an inherent failing, right? Because there could be things we haven't looked into that could complicate the things we have looked into. And all those things come from how we prioritize things. And how we prioritize things is going to come from a lot of your external factors. But I now, as I started to say that, it's probably not what Keegan was thinking at all. So I'll let him jump in, but that was what I started to think about.
It kind of is. I mean, just to build on what you're saying, I was more thinking that I don't know if Foucault would necessarily be criticizing the scientific method as such, but like we don't use the humors model of like the body anymore. Like, and so often what the scientific method produces is a model, because you have to create some sort of modeling system to comprehend it. So even if the scientific method itself, like in principle, isn't, it's not interested in creating this worldview that you have to believe in, we still see like over time, certain models of, for example, evolutionary biology, or certain models of physics. Like we had, there was a moment there where it seemed like string theory was going to be the way forward. And now it seems like there's a little bit more dispute about that. The issue is, I think we can all tend to be a little bit like on our, I don't know, like, I guess in a defensive stance about this, because so many people on like the creationist right will be like, oh, well, science used to say Pluto was a planet, and so what do you really know? Like, it can all be changed tomorrow. And we have to kind of like push back against that and say, no, like it's not just that we just changed our minds. There is like a real, the proof's in the pudding. You have the experimental data, and it is like empiricism, what you're talking about. But nevertheless, I think what Foucault is bringing in is actually what you were saying earlier. The thing that's way more complicated than physics is the human mind, because all of this has to be understood and processed by human minds. And that requires us to create a model. And then you run into basically like the problem of Gödel, of that you can't have a theory that's both complete and and correct. Can't be all encompassing and correct. You can look at these different elements. And I think what Jordan Peterson, I don't know if I actually watched the Peterson-Harris debates, actually. I listened to them debate on the podcast, but I'm familiar with both of them. And I remember Peterson would always talk about the frame problem, which in AI research was the issue of like figuring out ways to have a machine intelligence actually designate separate objects and understand that they were distinct from each other, and how the initial programmers of AI found out, oh, that's actually not a very obvious thing at all. Because when we look out, we're like, oh, it's an object, it's a copy cup, but also it's a trillion particles. It's also on all of these different levels of analysis, reality is going on. And so where is, like, what is your model take into account? And I think that is kind of the same thing that Matt was saying, of like what questions you're asking, because that's kind of how you generate your model. But I don't know. I guess what I would say is, like, I think it's maybe it's a little too idealistic to think that the scientific method can really be that this purely empirical tool, because it's always in the hands of people. Like, and so we will always, like, even if we're not saying you have to believe this model and it's like a dogma, nevertheless, like if you talk to people in the sciences, it can be really difficult to put forward some research if it goes against the current prevailing wisdom. And they might have good reasons for saying like, oh, well, the prevailing wisdom is this, so we have to be skeptical of someone who says that no, gravity is actually caused by the dancing mongoose in the center of the planet. We can't take that too seriously. But like, I don't know. I guess I would just say like there are conceptual structures that we will build up and sort of interpose on reality. And I think that's what Foucault's talking about with his nets. Is similar. Like if Peterson would have talking about it, he would have been using frames. And just as a quick aside, before I hand off the floor, that's another thing that's really interesting, is that Jordan Peterson seems to agree with a lot of postmodernist ideas a lot of the time. And I don't know, I can't help but wonder if a lot of his attacks on postmodernists is sort of like a projection, because he's like trying to like banish that from his soul, because he deep down like really sees some he sees the logic in it, and that kind of scares him, because he's like, no, we need these traditional structures to ground us in reality. But that's just an aside to bring in Papa Lobster into the discussion.
I could riff on Jordan Peterson's thought on postmodernism, but I do think that we want to. I assume you guys want to talk about the politics part of this debate more, because I think that's where things might get juicier, at least for Matt. So are you okay with transitioning to that, or are we at least somewhat at an agree to disagree to some extent on the scientific method, or do you want to close that out and then move on?
Well, I just have a quick point to make. We'll try not to turn that into another 15-minute discussion, but if it happens, so be it. I guess I just think that most scientists incorporate what you guys are saying. I think there's just I think a lot of these criticisms of science just derive from people, or that they come from people who don't really know what it means to do science. I mean, so like there's an interview out there on the internet where Chomsky, does make a point about how the fly's visual system is different from a human visual system, and that changes people's that changes perception, and that changes the way you can engage with reality. But I guess I think I don't know if I'm coming across as more idealistic than I am, but I don't think I'm actually being that idealistic, because I don't even think science is that idealistic. I think it's a fairly basic and simple idea that just happens to work when we're studying a lot of these topics related to studying the earth, or studying living organisms, or studying disease. But as I said, when you start talking about things like morality or politics, then it gets then you can't really apply the scientific method in the same way.
Yeah, so to some extent, what it sounds like you're saying is you're pretty much agreeing with what we're saying, and then you're saying that we aren't really disagreeing with you. We're more disagreeing with maybe people who make a poor argument, right? So there are people who will argue that science is more objective than you are, and you're willing to see that's not. So why are we criticizing science? And then I guess I could say we aren't criticizing it then, because then it sounds like we're on the same page. And I would add, because that's why I was kind of laughing when you started saying that, it kind of squares the circle of my analysis of what Jordan Peterson's doing with the postmodernism, because I think Jordan Peterson really, when he critiques postmodernism, he's critiquing people who have interpreted postmodernism poorly in order to serve a political agenda. So all of his critiques of postmodernism are critiquing people who read postmodernism into identity politics or something like that. So in reality, Jordan Peterson, and this is like Thaddeus Russell's kind of critique of people who are similar to Jordan Peterson, is, well, he's not really critiquing anything I stand for as a person who reads Foucault correctly. He's critiquing all the people who are pushing agendas that are based on it. So I guess a lot of what me and Keegan have kind of pointed out might apply to people who are overly objective about science, and then lean into things hard in order to push a certain message, and then that's kind of their pivot point. If you're willing to see it, well, these things could change if we do research it more, and that's the scientific method, then I think we're less likely to scrutinize it. But in practice, a lot of people think science is objective the end of the story. So if you're willing to say, well, that's not the end of the story, then I think I'm mostly on the same page as you. Obviously, Foucault, as a philosopher, would take that 30 levels deeper than I would. But as a person to person, and most contexts are relevant in our conversations. Like me and you, Matt, we're on the same page in terms of thinking about it in the modern day, at least, at the least.
If I could interject just one thing to maybe steelman Foucault's position there as I see it. Because I think I've hit it while Matt was talking, that it's when you said get to the end of the story, I feel like what maybe Foucault sees and what Chomsky was saying is that Chomsky's sort of suggesting that, because he said, yeah, it's not just building this edifice of knowledge, it kind of has a zigzag pattern, but you could see he's still zigzagged up, and so he still believes you're getting somewhere. And I think maybe what Matt maybe to synthesize what we're saying, which is an essential part of any steel manning, is that I think the important point you're focusing on is that science works even if you know that your model is not like absolute and it could be challenged and subject to falsification at a later date. And that's the powerful thing about science. But I think maybe what Foucault's criticizing is the view that like every scientific discovery, you get closer to like some sort of bedrock of truth. And that maybe you'd say, oh, okay, not too many people believe that. And I think you're right among scientists, but I think a lot of ordinary people actually believe that we're like getting closer, we're digging closer, and one day we're going to hit bedrock of the foundation of truth through just empiricism. And I think the Foucauldian like warning, maybe if it's not even a critique of any person, is like, hey, that's what the power of science is that you can work and use empiricism regardless of whether your model is final or not. You could understand Isaac Newton, whether it's apocryphal or not, can talk about gravity, even though he doesn't understand like the weak nuclear force and like the strong nuclear force. It still works. But the issue is when you say, okay, then Newton's discovery preceded us closer to the truth of things, and we're going to discover smaller and smaller particles, and then we're going to discover like that eventually we're going to like find the sheet music of the the universe or whatever. And I think that's maybe what he's saying. He's skeptical that can happen. I would say that's maybe the best steel man I can give of, I think, the Foucault position.
Well, I think at that point, then what I'm trying to say is kind of what Matt was saying. You know, I think people can frame this argument as scientists are lying to us because they're claiming to be objective and they're not. But I'm saying, well, I mean, we don't have to get into a conversation where we're defining words. What does it mean to be objective? But I think that if you truly talk to scientists and they explain to you as simply as they can what they're doing and how they're doing it, I think that most of them would agree that they're not going to. Science isn't really about system building, I guess is what I'm trying to say. At the end of the day, science is not about system building. A biochemist is thinking about the world in a very specific way. An evolutionary biologist is thinking about the world in a very specific way. A climate scientist is thinking about the world in a very specific way. And it's not about creating answers for all time. I think that is I think that's a good summary of my argument for the first portion of the debate. Matt, if you have anything else to add, you can, and then we can move on to politics.
I liked Keegan's summary a lot. I thought it was really good. I do think that for all practical purposes, there's something that we could reconcile that we'd all probably agree on in terms of actual pragmatism and what matters today. But I think Foucault gives a lot to think about. But yeah, I think we hit a wall on that one. Okay, Matt, do you want to lead in on the politics, or maybe Keegan can? There was a lot there, so there weren't things that jumped out to me in particular. But I don't want to lead that because, as anybody's listened to several episodes of the show, we've talked about Chomsky a few times. And there are certain things that Chomsky does that I find off-putting. So obviously, the first thing I like to bring up are things that annoy me or jump out to me. And all those things are probably things that Chomsky said. So if we want to avoid going down that rabbit hole, I think one of you guys should take the lead, and I'll go from there.
Well, I'll jump in because it's like a lefty kind of fight. And I think it's interesting because it's like if Chomsky is... Chomsky's sort of like the liberal left, and Foucault is representing the Marxist socialist sort of left in a way. And it is like how would you put it? It is a fault line. Like they're coming from almost different intellectual traditions. I mean, Marxism still comes out of a liberal tradition, but it's like splintering onto a new branch, and where there's like a really fundamental disagreement. And like it really comes out in the discussion over whether the dictatorship of the proletariat would be this horrible, violent, repressive thing. And Foucault's sort of response to that in a sense, that would be an incomplete revolution. That wouldn't be possible for a true dictatorship of the proletariat to happen. But furthermore, he's not even really, you can tell he's like, I don't really even want to have this discussion because I'm not thinking about this as a way to get justice in the abstract as some sort of moral principle or moral program that we're following. This is all just like the first and foremost center of what Foucault is talking about is class struggle. And so he basically really, and this is where like maybe the Petersonian critique is a little bit apt of turning everything into a power thing, but that's totally where he's coming from, that this is all about, okay, if you're in this certain class of people, you recognize what's to your advantage. To your advantage is to overthrow the class that is exploiting you. And that's a material reality. That's real. That's rubber hits the road. Like, whereas Chomsky is appealing to, I think he really believes in that like liberal tradition, which in fact, like he's talked about a little bit, that there's like this one Enlightenment era German intellectual who Chomsky said like really inspired a lot of his politics.
Humboldt, I believe, one of the
I think so. But yeah, and that's the thing that it's kind of, maybe some people forget this because Chomsky is like considered like a socialist. But I am using like liberal, like big L liberal, like as in terms of like liberal democracy, that Chomsky does come from that position. And I think a lot of why is because like he's an anarchist, which is sort of the like the I would say like the epitome of the liberal tradition of maximum individual rights and sovereignty, of taking these ideas of the rights that have to be given to each man, and saying like, yeah, we need to be liberated from all of that, and everyone is like the font of their own sort of individual rights. And I don't know, it was yet again, just like with the first person, they kind of slid past each other at times because they're coming almost from such entirely different ways of thinking about it, that it's kind of almost hard for them to like find the friction of where they're clashing. But whenever they did, it was when like probably the most that I saw Chomsky actually react, like he was like, no, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. When Foucault says it's not about justice, it's all about power. And that to me, so I don't know, that was sort of my reaction on where they stood politically. And I don't know, I'm not really a Marxist, but I am probably closer to Foucault's view of things, of looking at things just in terms of realpolitik and like that people being driven by material realities rather than some sort of like building towards this abstract project of like, you know, human value and universal brotherhood of men and all that, which I think Chomsky really does believe, which obviously does because of all the work he did against Vietnam and all that, which so yeah, I don't know if that gives you all a jumping off point. I don't know if I really said where I come down, I guess more on the Foucault side, but again, I don't know if I completely agree with him.
So I guess in my introduction to the show, I said I got more out of Foucault's interpretation of politics than I did his interpretation of science and a foundation of knowledge. And I guess it goes back to something Matt mentioned, which was our last episode on political ideologies, where we were talking past each other. I guess I am kind of at a point where I'm thinking a bit more about, I guess, the nature of politics or the nature of political philosophy, and where do one's values come from? How is one able to defend one's values if politics isn't like objective in the same way that arithmetic is? Can you still come to some truths, or can you still construct arguments for? Can you still construct defensible arguments, or are you just or are you just appealing to subjective emotional states that there's no way of making heads or tails of? And so I guess I find myself in a position where I think Chomsky and I agree a lot on in terms of values. I would say I also come from the liberal tradition. I was actually talking to someone not too long ago, and I I describe myself in a certain way, and I try to avoid this term because it's become so tainted now. But both of you are very familiar, I'm sure, with the term classical liberal. Nowadays, of course, that means conservative, because someone like Dave Rubin, another topic that we've talked about fairly frequently on the show, or another person we've talked about fairly frequently on the show, and I'm not very sympathetic to that man. But like Dave Rubin calls himself a classical liberal. I forget, one of the Koch brothers calls himself a classical liberal. So now it means in everyday political language, now that just means conservative. But when I say I come from the tradition of classical liberalism, I literally mean going back to people like Rousseau and Voltaire, and the Enlightenment values, Montesquieu. So in that sense, Chomsky and I agree. But I guess where I fall more on the Foucault side, or where I absorb more from Foucault's arguments, is this: I don't feel able to. I don't feel in a position yet to be able to construct, or to give really a name to what my political philosophy is, or what I think a just society should be. Now, I guess Chomsky would say, or Chomsky was kind of saying, I mean, yeah, you can't just really sketch it out in vivid detail. But he would still say, he's an anarchist, an anarcho-syndicalist, if we want to be very technical about it. But I can't really pinpoint a particular term. I don't really feel comfortable calling myself an anarchist or a Marxist or a liberal, in the sense that I guess there are certain political questions that maybe I haven't answered, that I don't feel like I've answered well enough, or I lack the confidence to say that I know how the world should be run. So that's kind of my thought process related to the second portion of the debate.
So I'm going to bring up a philosopher that's not the most relevant here, but it's always been a person who's in to some extent, in my brain space, and it's Kant. And Foucault's almost making a somewhat Kantian point, because Foucault is kind of pointing out the inherent value of fighting the fight. And that's something that him and Chomsky kind of squabble over, because Chomsky kind of says, okay, well, if I resist and then there's an overwhelming wave of fascism because I resisted, then I shouldn't resist, right? Because then in the end, the ends hurt my cause more than I want. And then Foucault is kind of like, I don't know, dude, it's class warfare. Those people are awful. Like, the point is you fight them. And that's like a really low level way of analyzing it, but it's like Chomsky's kind of taking this consequentialist view of like, well, we understand we understand politics is a game, and you want to reach the certain ends that are somewhat closer to your values. And then Foucault's kind of like, well, it's good because it's the class warfare. And this is where I end up kind of outing myself as being more sympathetic to people who use language like Foucault, because I would just appropriate everything that they're saying about class warfare and the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and then I'd take the same thing. I just see the ruling class as a different group of people. I don't necessarily see it as corporations. I see it as any beneficiary of cronyism and the government that I think is illegitimate. So I actually am like really on the same page as Foucault. I just see a different coalition against a different enemy. And to some extent, like, if there were people who agreed with me that did things, it could lead to more overreach that I'd be against. And then that's the Chomsky case against that kind of political action. But on the other hand, if there was, and this is why we did an episode on the insurrection, and then I took the very, very unpopular position of saying, even though I don't agree with anybody who was there at the Capitol Hill, I'm happy that those people had their building broken into and their stuff destroyed, right? And because I think they're evil, terrible people, and I'm very comfortable saying things like that. And that's me taking the Foucault stance of, in of itself, that struggle against the class you hate is good. Right. So to some extent, you have Foucault talking about the means and really, really hearkening on the means, and almost not even wanting to talk about the ends, because he doesn't find the ends in an abstract level interesting. And then Chomsky in the end is really all about the ends. He's like, well, I protest because I think it'll save people's lives. And it's like, hey, that's a valid position too. So in the end, I almost think it was two left-wing people having the age-old conversation of why politics is a constant struggle to get people on the same page, especially people who are in the same ballpark, but it's hard to agree on what political action is necessary. And the main reason why is because in the end, it's kind of a quantitative question that you don't really have access to the information on. So it's like doing what is truly right because we don't have the information, or trying to be analytical about it. So it was almost like watching these two philosophical giants have this practical conversation that is actually like always present in every realm of politics, no matter what side of the spectrum you are. So it was a novelty for that reason alone in my book. And I think that's what I mostly got out of it, especially because I'm not a leftist, right? So I had to kind of co-opt it and then understand how I could process it in a way that's relevant to me.
Well, it's almost, I wonder if it wouldn't be similar to like maybe, you know, an American sort of like traditional, very traditional conservative and like an objectivist, both agreeing broadly, and maybe they both are on the right wing nominally, but they're coming from such a very different like first principles is kind of what it is. And so they reach the same endpoints in a lot of their values, but I think the first principles are very different. And I think you're right. It's like for Chomsky, it is very, very consequentialist when he's talking about, okay, my tax dollars are going to this rampaging imperial army. I'm causing something bad, regardless of what my intentions are. Therefore, I must stop that and bring about this good world. But it's interesting because he almost seems to have this like moral sense of moral absolutes, because there's this idea that you're like building towards this ideal state of affairs, and like some sort of something in the fundamental human nature that you know, there is a set of circumstances that is ideal for the innate human nature that we can like build towards. And so I don't know how to classify Chomsky, and I think part of that is if he is like, to maybe be a little too poetic about it, if he is this like avatar of like the liberal mind, both probably in both senses of the word, that there is kind of that contradiction of the moral absolutes versus consequentialism, because a lot of liberal thought is very absolutist, but a lot of it is also very consequentialist. And I don't know if I have anything intelligent to like tease it out at the moment, other than to say, then we look at Foucault, he, I mean, one of the things he criticizes about Chomsky, he's like trying to disentangle how Chomsky uses words, where he's saying, okay, something the state calls illegal that you say should be legal, or okay, you would attack their justice, but that must be in the name of some sort of pure justice. And he's trying to sort of like, I think he wanted Chomsky to like articulate, okay, what is this objective moral standard that you have, and how do you come to it? How do you know that it's there? Because you're just saying like, we have this inkling that there's this human nature and we're kind of grasping and struggling for it, which is the scientific sort of mindset and that reality that Matt was kind of bringing up earlier. But I think Foucault wanted him to like, he wanted to know like, what is this, like with Kant, for example, categorical imperative, like this explicitly stated, here is the core of morality, I've distilled it. I think he wanted something like that from Chomsky. In kind of when they got into like the dialogue later in the political discussion. But I don't think it was really there, because I don't know if Chomsky has something like that, other than just sort of the, like, I think there is in the, like the dark beating heart of moral philosophy at the end of the day is that it's all pretty much subjective. You can't really get out of that because human beings are subjects, not objects. So what we want is not going to be universal, and these competing demands will be in conflict. But that kind of again puts me on the Foucault side, because that's sort of like the blunt material reality. You have these two forces that are in conflict, and there's no way we're going to like intellectually settle this. You have to have a physical struggle. And I think again, maybe that particular tension didn't come out in the debate. That also probably is another thing underlying like Chomsky, that the liberal mindset does tend to be post-enlightenment, that you should be able to, if you have like an objective moral principle, you should be able to, through logic, prove it to other people and show them that that's how you should act. Foucault kind of doesn't seem to think that. he seems to think, well, no, like if you're a bourgeois and you have all these external factors that are making you think that your position of comfort in society is earned and deserved, why would you ever be won over by an argument from the proletariats that their stuff should be reappropriated? That's never going to happen. So it's a conflict, not a dialogue, really, which is kind of a contradictory position when you're a philosopher. But some of those are my favorite philosophers. So and I guess to bring in a parallel with another debate that just occurred to me now, this is not too dissimilar from the Karl Popper-Wittgenstein debate either, where Karl Popper was very much about the set of principles of the open society, liberalism, and Wittgenstein was a raving lunatic, but also a brilliant guy who criticized that on the same basis of language, of not, you don't really know how to define what it is you're talking about. And I think that does kind of still, that's probably why, even though I don't necessarily fully fellow traveler with Foucault, I kind of get what he's saying, because it is hard for me to see what this abstract principle behind Chomsky's values really are, if that makes sense.
So I guess I have something I want to say about kind of objective versus subjective morality. But before that, I have a quick question. Again, either or both of you can answer. Maybe this was the language barrier and I didn't pick this up, but I didn't quite, I guess I didn't quite get, or so Matt, when I heard you kind of rephrasing Foucault's argument about politics, I guess I didn't quite I didn't have the same takeaway. So I'm just, I didn't quite hear him be, I guess the way I was interpreting Foucault, and this is why I'm asking the question. I want you guys to correct me if I misinterpreted. I really took his position on politics to be very similar to Nietzsche's view on politics. He was sort of, I took Foucault's position to be, he was distancing himself from politics in a way that Chomsky, or political ideology or political philosophy, in a way that Chomsky was not. I didn't quite hear that firebrand, we need to fight the enemy kind of spirit or argument in what he was saying. It almost, and this is not a good way to characterize Foucault, but it sounded very more pessimistic or almost a little nihilistic at some level.
I think maybe where he's getting that is when Foucault, because I wrote it down, where he appeals to Spinoza, who was and says that the proletarians are doing this because they want power, not because it's a just war. Chomsky was bringing in the idea of a just war versus an unjust war, and I think it's Foucault's sort of rejection of that, knowing, maybe he's not so much of a firebrand in that discussion, but knowing that he is ultimately with the proletarians on it. Right, so he's like, that's just what they're gonna.
Was he though? Because I thought he was basically saying like he was basically saying, well, I don't know, I can't construct a just society in my mind because I'm bounded by the values of my own society, and a proletarian revolution will, in the same way, be bounded by current values, just in the same way that like the Soviet Union was bounded by the values of the bourgeoisie.
I think he was saying that's like a pitfall, though, of what Chomsky's doing. Is he's saying like, you trying to come up with these ideas of like what justice will look like from our current society is like, that was, I think, Foucault saying like, that's why that wasn't real communism.
Yeah,
in a way, basically.
Yeah, so the part where in my mind he was kind of like a firebrand saying you should be fighting them for the sake of fighting them, is when he talks about the power dynamics. He was kind of saying the proletariat shouldn't overthrow the bourgeoisie because it's consequentialist reasoning. It's because they want the power the bourgeoisie has. So it's not really about getting concessions politically. It was more of, we have a struggle over power and this team's losing, so they're going to go try to take it from the other team. And then I agree with what Keegan just said about the other aspect of it. Yeah.
I guess what I'm asking then, and I don't. I guess what I'm asking then is like, was he making a moral judgment about it? Because I got the sense he was basically saying like, at some level the proletariat will be like the new bourgeoisie, when they overthrow the bourgeoisie, or when they overthrow capitalism, or when they overthrow the capitalists, like you can't say it's moral or immoral. You can't
He
say
was
it's
more
just
making
or
a
unjust. You can't say it's right or wrong. It's just a change in the power structure. So that's what confused me. I didn't get the sense he was really siding with anybody. I got the sense he was distancing himself from politics because he was seeing it through Nietzsche's through the Nietzschean view.
I think
of
he's
the will
very
to power.
it's what you're picking up on is he's being descriptive rather than prescriptive. He's just saying, like, this is the reality that the proletarians are going to do this because that's what drives human beings. And he's rejecting the sort of prescriptive argument of like, yeah, they're doing it because they should do it. It's like some sort of moral imperative. He's sort of saying that's not it at all. They want the power that they have, so that's what they're going to do. But I just, knowing Foucault and his level of analysis, I think ultimately he probably, I mean, he might have denied it was a moral valuation, but I think he was on team proletarian. He was cheerleading. He had the pom-poms that were red,
yeah.
obviously red, and was for that. I think his issue with I think he thinks there might be some idealized state where there's a total egalitarianism, which is probably not too dissimilar from Chomsky's anarcho-syndicalism. Again, like reaching the same place. My difference with him there would be like, no, I don't think you can. I think you will always create a new bourgeois, but that's probably beyond the scope of this discussion. I don't know.
Okay, yeah. Well, I guess I was just a bit confused by Foucault's position. Again, partly the language barrier, and partly probably just Foucault's kind of unique way of talking about these issues. But I guess maybe for the last portion of our discussion, I would like to talk a little bit on the question of like objective versus subjective morality. Because I was thinking about this last night, and this probably does sound like a cop-out, but I'm going to say it anyway. At the very least, it'll ignite a fire in one of you. Does it really even matter how we're defining, if we're defining morality as subjective or objective? So, and I guess to kind of make my own position clear, I was originally more in the moral relativist camp. Like I remember reading The Moral Landscape by Sam Harris that you mentioned, and while I was reading it, I was critiquing it on that basis. And then I got a bit older, and I started to think more along the lines of Sam Harris or Chomsky or Noam Chomsky in the sense that there are values that are more grounded, that we can kind of discern. And I guess now I'm just trying to maybe learn more about the issue in the hopes of clearing it up, at least for myself. But it's like I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. Like, what is it? Why do we have these conversations? Like, why do people talk about that in the first place? Because, I mean, I don't think people generally. Oh, let me put it to you like this. I guess people's worldview, and that includes their morality, their ethics. I guess morality is the more individual. I guess morality is more at an individual level, and ethics is more overarching, first principles, or the perspective of a broader, from the big picture perspective. But I don't think people really live their lives as if their values aren't at some level real. And now, like, we could make the argument that, well, they're all, like Max Stirner would say, they're all spooks. It doesn't matter. But like, I guess really what I'm getting at, maybe this is almost some form of moral intuitionism that I'm coming to. Not to throw out academic jargon there, but because I was having a conversation with people about like the trolley problem, as you guys probably know. The idea, if anyone who's listening to this podcast doesn't know, it's the idea that like there's a trolley running down a hill on the tracks, and there's like 5 people tied to that tied to the train tracks, and they will certainly be run over. But there's a lever that you pull, and it'll divert the train to another track, but you'll be killing one person. That there are different versions of the trolley problem, but that gets the point across. So it's like, would you pull the lever? Because if you do the moral calculus in your head, it's like, well, you're saving a net 4 people. One person has to die, but that's fewer people that have to die. So many people would say, yeah, you pull that lever. But maybe what I'm saying is, I don't think moral philosophy really matters in everyday life. And maybe so at some level, maybe my moral values are a bit jumbled, but by extension, maybe everyone's moral values are jumbled, and that's okay. So again, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. I really need to do a lot more studying in moral philosophy before I can write my 800-page tome on that solves all these complex problems. So I'll give either of you. I guess Matt wants to speak first, so I'll give him the floor.
Well, in a way, you're kind of saying what's the value of moral philosophy when people don't abide by the morals we derive, right? So you can try to derive objective morals, but then it's like, well, if the Crusades happen and a bunch of people are massacred for dumb reasons, that was clearly it's like whatever we derive doesn't rule the world. And it's kind of I know you remember, Matt, but way back when we had an argument on positive and negative rights, and I postulated some sort of negative right, and then you said, yeah, but then what stops the other caveman from coming in, hitting you on the head with like whatever dinosaur bone they find, and then stealing your stuff? And then I had to say, well, I still had the like more rooted, what I would argue is somewhat objective property claim to whatever I argued that I was able to derive in a way that I thought was logical. So then you're kind of bringing up, okay, but what does that matter? And I think the best that it can matter for is when you try to flesh out things like law, right? If you're going to talk about pragmatism, because if we have a structure to analyze what is moral and what is immoral, then if you're going to do something that formally gauges society, whether that's property rules on your own private property or whether it's legal rules in the United States that we have today, that's where moral philosophy would ideally come in. Now, what ends up happening in real life, if you live in a system like ours, where, I mean, you could argue that it's somewhat pseudo-democratic, then it is really just run on the intuitions that a lot of people seem to believe in, and then seem to vote for people that seem to agree with their intuitions. If you live in a different society that is more top-down rule, I mean, you still get more of the same. It's just the intuitions of those rulers, and then maybe they're not going to bind the same rules to themselves, so they can get away with stuff they know is bad on an easier basis. So I guess what I would say is it doesn't matter that much when you're governed, because it really just matters what the government's intuitions are. But if you derive a different kind of moral philosophy, then you can try to change the world in ways that you think are more true. Now, people can question whether there's something out there that is more true. But if you're going to argue about its utility, then I would say, well, if you can derive something, then you know the way you want to try to push the world or what is in your domain. But that isn't to say, like, I guess Jordan Peterson kind of says, you have to live your values and live your morals and whatever. And I think that's kind of not true, because a lot of things you do don't have moral value. Like brushing your teeth doesn't really have moral value. And going to work, if you work at a generic desk job, does not really have moral value.
I think Peterson would say it does.
Yeah, you're right. Maybe I'm intentionally misreading Peterson because I just think that's a stupid contention. That's very possible and is very self-serving, so I could see myself doing it. But I would argue that those things don't really have moral values. But if there are morals we can derive, then your goal is to try to try to popularize that, because like you and I, Matt, so something, and I assume Keegan, just because you're a person who's having this type of conversation, and you're in circles that Matt found you'd probably be like, for basic things that most people agree on in 2021, like legalizing marijuana. And we would probably all argue that because we, to some degree, agree on bodily autonomy, and we, to some degree, say it's nonviolent, it's all peaceful, and so forth. So if you can derive the values that go into why we think that's legal and then apply them to other things, then we can strive for a more just world. And I think that plays into moral philosophy. Now, I think the real problem that you're hinting at is the lack of utility of real world, of like full universal scale type things. So if you try to flesh something out that is wholly explaining and wholly universal, then it's like, well, what is the utility once you've scoped all this out and only you agree with it? It's like probably not a lot. And then you run into other issues. But that's my intuition of the question you're posing.
Yeah, I just wanted to add quickly. I don't think I actually connected why I brought up the trolley problem in the first place. So let me just do that, and then I'll let Keegan jump in. The reason I brought up the trolley problem in the first place was because someone was asking me, like, "What are you gonna do, Matthew? Are you gonna pull that lever and have that one person die, or are you going to let the 5 people die and do nothing?" And my response was, and they weren't particularly, the people I was talking to weren't particularly pleased with it because they thought it was me dodging. But my response was, most people aren't gonna, they're not gonna think about the moral calculus in that situation. Just whatever kind of feels right to them, they're gonna do. And a moral philosopher could explain to them, a moral philosopher could explain to them, well, if you do that, that's immoral for all these reasons. I'm not sure that's necessarily going to affect people's actions in the way that moral philosophers would want. So yeah, that was I needed to square that circle before we went on.
Well, what's interesting about the trolley problem, and I think I'm gonna try and thread a line through this. It's like the reason why I think a lot of people have a issue with thought experiments is because they seem so outlandish, because most people are not ever going to be in that situation where you have a clear cut, you throw this lever, you know what will happen more or less from either outcome. And so it puts you in this sense of like total clarity and like power. You have all the power in the situation to determine like the outcome. And like the reality, like Matt was saying about when we're governed, most of the time people don't have the power to make those kinds of moral decisions. And if they do find themselves in a situation like, am I going to like dive in front of this person to push them out of the way of a car or whatever it might be, you don't actually have total clarity. It's not like flipping a switch and one thing for sure happens or another. And that's often like the reality is really messy. And so people use these thought experiments to like try and get that sense of clarity in their beliefs. But like, as you're kind of pointing out, like, what does that really matter? Because what is that a process of? That's the process of building this edifice of like trying to come up with this coherent, consistent morality that if it's not written into law does not matter at all. Because, and I think what you're getting at with the whole thing of like the law is what we're talking about now in politics is it's like, it's not just the things you think are morally right. It's the things that you're like, I will use force to actually prevent that thing from happening because it's not just morally wrong, but like it should be legally wrong. We'll use collective violence against this. And so that's like a level of, and I think that's why people want to sort of tease these things out. As for how it relates to objective versus subjective morality, though, I always just come back to like, I think you're right that it's kind of a meaningless question because it's I think what people are really attacking when they go after objective or subjective morality is just the notion of kind of what you're saying, that like it undermines like all morals in a way that makes it hard to have a conviction, I guess, maybe. That's what somebody like Peterson might have an issue with, that is that you need to have that conviction and you need to be willing to, like in the way that we're talking about, again, the only relevant way, be willing to use force to defend it. You have to have this conviction. And I think it's like a hangover from our religious thinking that this has to be grounded in like something transcendent that's like above mankind and can't be questioned at all. And I think it's just somewhat scary to like step outside of that and say, I recognize that morality is in all its subjectivity, this product of my relative upbringing, but I still will be comfortable saying, in all its arbitrariness, this is what I demand, and this is my values, and this is what I stand for in the world. And so that's how I kind of disentangle it. But as far as I mean, yeah, I mostly agree. It's where people get really concerned about like what your objective moral claims are is when it involves taking the levers of power. And I mean, and maybe just a concluding thought that you brought up about like marijuana, we probably all would agree with that, but it's interesting because it's like these first principles really affect how you end up arguing about things. And I can't help but think about like in 2012 when they were legalizing it in Colorado, the argument, so you said like, yeah, ideas of bodily autonomy. That would be an idea that I would base why I would say marijuana should be legal. But that actually wasn't the argument that was persuasive. The argument they used in Denver was it's not opium, it's not cocaine, it's a much more, it's more like alcohol, it's more like cigarettes, it's more like the drugs that are good. And what's interesting is one of those is like that's kind of the utilitarian consequentialist view versus the more objective moral standard of this is my bodily autonomy, this is an absolute, you can't tell me I can't take any substance, I should be able to take PCP if I want. And that's kind of more where I fall. But it's like that, and maybe that's to like loop it back of like why this matters, these moral discussions that can kind of change the direction of the zeitgeist in a way. Thankfully it hasn't. It seems like the attitude in the country is generally like we should just legalize because that's the rational thing to do. But it did like, just even in that first state that legalized, there was that back and forth of like some people who were just making the argument for I don't know, like pragmatic reasons of saying, well, it's not really an issue of principle. It's just, it's not that harmful, so we should let the kids have their fun or whatever. I forget the name of the guy who was spearheading it, but I don't know. I used to know the names and the people involved a lot more.
Yeah, and I think that brings up all kinds of interesting things that we probably touched on in past episodes, like how political messaging can be effective and what kind of messaging like I would like to see used by certain groups of people and so forth. Because you're right. When I talk to a lot of people, all agree on things for completely different reasons. And it's like, well, congrats, we agree on this issue, but we don't have any of the same intuitions, or it's like somebody will still have X, Y, and Z reasoning that I'm not sympathetic to, but at least, we get to the same conclusion, and that ends up being important. Now, what I was going to say about trolley problems, I guess, well, yeah, it does come back to the Chomsky, Foucault, and it comes to means and ends. And I almost don't even think there's a lot to say there, because in the end, though, Matt, I think the point you're making is people don't have a personal philosophy; they just kind of do things, and that's kind of what Keegan's getting at too. So it's like, if I'm faced with the trolley problem, it's hard to put myself and empathize with that person. But in the end, it's like, well, what am I going to do? I'm just going to do what seems right in the moment, regardless of what philosophy I've read, right? It's like, if it seems easier to just press the button and get one person killed instead of 5, which is probably what I do, then I do that. And I don't even think that really reflects underlying arguments I'd make that seem potentially opposed to those. I almost think a lot of those philosophical games are interesting for discussion, but when people use them to argue points, they end up being traps that are more anti-intellectual than anything. So I'm always skeptical of those little games. But I do think you raised the subjective rights question and the utility of it correctly. Yeah. I don't know if there's a lot else there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a little more to say, and then we can wrap up or do whatever we want to do from there. So, I mean, basically what I did just now then is I was, okay, when I was introducing my kind of moral framework, I was saying as I got older, I was coming more towards some sort of moral objectivity or moral universalism, but then I kind of raised a question which I guess would almost seem like a question which someone who is more of a moral relativist would raise. So I guess then at this point, I might try to maybe steelman moral universalism or moral objectivity, or at least try to give an argument that makes some sense to me, even if I'm not able to defend it completely, or even if I'm not able to put forward a system which answers all questions, which again, apparently in this podcast, we've figured out you can't do via Gödel. So that's not he say his name, is it? Anyway, I was actually, okay, so for this conversation, I was watching another video, and I probably should have sent this to you guys before we did the episode, but it was another video of Chomsky talking about moral relativism more explicitly. And his argument was interesting. His argument was, okay, so first he was saying that, like, values are very different across cultures and time periods. And he was saying, like, yes, that's a fact. Anthropologists and archaeologists will tell you that that's a truism, and no one denies that. But it was interesting. So Chomsky was he was basically like putting moral he was basically arguing against moral relativism through the lens of moral relativism, and I say that because he was saying that moral relativism is incoherent because it is acknowledging that there is such a thing as a moral structure. It's just saying that there are like so many, like that there are various like places you can be within that moral structure. So that was interesting. Because he was basically saying, well, moral relativists, they're actually moral objectivists, or they're actually talking about like that they're actually talking about the limits of morality in a way that is that undermines their own case. And so that was really interesting to me, because it made me think about moral relativism, I guess, in a way that I hadn't really thought of it before. And then I guess to add to that, I think maybe the way I think about morality and ethics is, or like perhaps there are certain things, or there are certain moral questions which you can answer, and then other questions which are a bit more ambiguous, or perhaps there are certain values which can be universalized or are universalizable than others that aren't. It might not necessarily be a black and white issue. There might be a way to finesse both universal values and acknowledging how different humans can be. Because I think you could make a strong argument that there are limits to human morality, or at least there are limits in the sense that there are limits to human action. And I mean, because I think there are aspects, or there are moral views I have, which I think are which I think are defensible, and which I think probably should be universalizable. But I guess where I'm still struggling, or where I'm the part of my worldview that's a bit fuzzier, is laying more of a foundation for some of those views, because anyone can come in. Anyone can enter this discussion and be like, but why? But why? But why? How do you know that? How do you know that? How do you know that? Kind of like what Foucault is doing, not to put down Foucault. So I guess really at the end of the day, what I'm saying is I really don't have all the answers. I'm trying to work through this in real time. But I think it's important that we have these. I do think it's important that we have these discussions. So I actually don't think moral philosophy is useless or irrelevant. I guess the question might be like, how influential are you going to be? And that's, I guess, debatable. But I still think we should have these conversations, because at some level, I mean, ideas. So everyone knows the term trickle down economics. It's like, well, ideas trickle down. It's like the ideas of the Enlightenment are now a lot of common people. They spout that they're talking about, or they argue for these Enlightenment values, and they didn't come from the average
Trickle
person.
down
It came from the.
enlightenment.
I'm sorry.
It's the trickle down enlightenment.
The trickle down effect, I guess, is what I'm saying, that of ideas, so they can have an effect. I think I made my point clear. So moral philosophy is important. I have yet to come to easy answers to these questions, and I don't want to be dogmatic about it, even though I think many of my moral positions are defensible or, to put it more provocatively, correct.
I think I'll let that sit. But yeah, I for the most part agree with the general idea. It's a struggle that we find important, although I wouldn't necessarily say it's important like a lot of things are. I think this is something I've mentioned on the show before, but the fact that we often argue about our political intuitions and then politics in general and then philosophy is interesting to us, but I still don't see a reason why the average person should really concern themselves with it to any degree. And it's almost more just something we're interested in. And I'm okay with that. I don't think a lot of people should try to derive their ethics. It's kind of, it just keeps you up at night, probably better than it does, but we all do it because we feel like it's important. And I think to some extent, at least for this conversation's purposes, that's good enough. It's not like any of us are currently in a prominent position of power where we really need to recheck our ethical grounding and make sure, to keep our consciences clear. But yeah, I'm cool with leaving it there. Any closing thoughts, Keegan?
Yeah, I'll tag onto that. There's a reason why a lot of the old ethical texts were addressed to the prince or the king. That philosophers back in the day really understood you got to get this into the hands of the guy with the army. And like everything, even in like the peaceful, like Lao Tzu, like the Tao Te Ching, that's for a prince to read. So I mean, it's nice if you read it and get something out of it. And that's all. Yeah, like you said, clarifying our ethical positions is something we find fun. But it is, on some level, the debate over whether morality is subjective or not, it's important if you're a prince. If not,
Well,
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna move to wrap up, so you can go for it.
No, I was just gonna say, a funny little historical anecdote is when the French, I think he was German philosopher, D'Holbach, he wrote a book. I forget the name of it now. When he was a Enlightenment philosopher, and he was arguing for materialism and atheism, and a lot of the more radical views of the Enlightenment. And then Voltaire, a philosopher I'm always bringing up, as Keegan will tell you, he inserted into his philosophical dictionary a refutation of D'Holbach, and in like a little almost like letter or something addressed to the author about how he was wrong about all these philosophical issues. And then he says something about the people do not read us. So I was just thinking, the people do not listen to us. Well, so and this podcast will reach a few souls, hopefully. Maybe we'll change a few minds, or at least get people thinking about the issues. But unfortunately, the vast majority of people in this world will not listen to us talk for an hour and a half.
Probably not all that different from the Chomsky-Foucault debate in that regard.
This is true.
Well, we should all be privileged enough to know that our betters, the people above us in society, they're smarter because they listen to NPR, and NPR will give them a 30-second summary.
They read the New York Times.
Yeah. Well, in NPR, they can explain all of what Keynesianism even means in 30 seconds, and you can nod your head and then be happy. I was going to try to come up with a crude joke or a bad taste comment about how all this wraps up with Matt bringing up a German philosopher and how that's interesting that seems to happen. But somebody could think of a funnier comment in that respect than I could there. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to this episode. I think it was fairly successful having a third person on, and I appreciate you joining us for this one, Keegan, because you definitely had more insight than I did. And you have a way better background on this stuff than I do. So it's always good to get another voice.
It's a miracle it didn't crash and burn.
Well, it's a miracle that we have an episode that didn't end up with me and Matt going agree to disagree 2 or 3 times. So I hope people derive some sort of value from this, as much value as you can derive from moral philosophy, apparently. And that you can feel free to check out our backlog of other episodes of Beyond Talking Points. I know they're uploaded under Beyond Talking Points YouTube channel now. If you search that and scroll down, I think if you just type in Beyond Talking Points and scroll a little bit, you'll find the account that has all the episodes. And we got 40 something episodes of us arguing about other obscure debates, like how we talked about Walter Block and eviction theory and all that kind of stuff, and other esoteric things that are interesting to task yourselves with. So with all that, thank you for tuning in. And until next time, it's Matt and Keegan. Thank you.